where were you brought up? Were you brought up in the UK?
I was in, Portsmouth
Yeah.
direction with my mum, and my dad had a sort of small holding farm near Winchester. So split my time between Portsmouth for schooling and then weekends on the farm, really, which was quite a nice way to grow up.
And sustainability is important to you?
Massively
Why is
important
that?
to me. I didn't really realise it until I was probably in my third year of university, and I started to go, right, what am I going to do? And I wanted to make a difference. And all I wanted to spend my time kind of doing work-wise was being able to look back and say it was worth it. And especially when I had Freya, it became even more important because I wasn't the stay-at-home parent and I did leave her and go to work. I needed that kind of almost justification to myself for why I was going back to work, and being able to say to her, I'm doing something to help reduce emissions, help with climate change, help sustainability, help with your future, really made it easier.
Well, just one of the things that's intriguing me is that the concept of a stay-at-home dad with a full-time mum out working.
Yeah.
And the reason that intrigues me is because that's non-standard. The standard thing is the dad goes out to work, the mum predominantly is the caregiver at home.
Yeah.
How did that conversation start, or where did that start with you and your husband?
So we were quite young when that conversation started. I was actually in a bit of a motorbike crash when I was 21 and got quite a rare pain condition. It's all to do with my brain. We kind of knew that I wasn't going to be able to stay at home. It was just something we always knew wouldn't be possible. So I had no choice but to be the one to go to work. So as I got pregnant and getting closer to the birth, the reality started hitting us that this is what we're going to do. Yeah, it was probably quite difficult for my husband, who suddenly found himself in quite a mother-centric world, which, it is when you've got newborn babies, going to groups where he was the only dad. All the conversations about baby help when they're newborn is written towards mothers. And yeah, he had quite a steep learning curve. And I did as well, because I don't think anything prepares you, whether you're a mum or a dad, for going back to work after you've had a child. And yeah, quite a steep learning curve for us both.
I've not found anything prepares you to actually have a child, to be honest.
Nothing to have a child. No, it definitely doesn't. Nothing prepares you for your change in mindset.
Yeah.
I was very driven even before I had Freya, my daughter. Since having her, the idea of working to make a difference is just taking on a whole new meaning. I'm not just working for a better future, I'm working for her future, so that she's got a more stable environment as she grows up. And that's one of the biggest drivers that I think I've ever had.
Sounds like it's got personal for you.
It has definitely got personal for me. And I think being able to make this difference in a company like BEAMA, where I've got flexibility, CEOs, she's got 2 young children herself, and she's very family orientated as well. So being able to be in that environment where I'm supported as a mother, but making a huge difference to 200 odd member companies to become more sustainable, it's worked out quite well.
How do you feel supported then in BEAMA?
So I think having a CEO who has 2 young kids herself, and there are several of us who actually have toddlers, having that flexibility for her to be let's change the world, let's make it more sustainable, let's do what we can to support our members. But changing the world only happens if you're stable and happy at home. So being told, my daughter does ballet on a Friday morning, being told, oh, don't go miss it, just go, don't worry about work, just go see her do ballet. To be told it's okay, you can work at home, and if you want to take that time, just go play with her, go hug her. If she's ill and you want to focus on her, that's 100% where your focus should be. And that's sort of the ethos of the company, which is amazing.
Sounds like your CEO is removing the guilt from being a parent and also loving your job.
I would definitely say so. Yeah, she's done an absolute brilliant job at doing that, and she's relatively new CEO to our company as well, and previously did the role that I'm doing. Okay. So not only has she got this amazing culture going on within BEAMA, but she's also quite passionate about net zero and making sure that we all achieve it. And she's a real supporter of a scientific net zero and believes that we can do it. So it's quite a nice sort of culture and environment to find yourself working in.
What attributes do you think that she has that enables this and fosters this change in culture?
So I would definitely say that empathy has to be one of them. And one thing you learn quite quickly when you become a parent is empathy. So having that empathy and the flexibility mindset that she has been quite key. And she's quite an authoritative person. And it took me quite a long time, but being authoritative is about caring about your own needs, but also caring about the needs of others. And she really does care about the needs of others while she's sort of running this big trade association who've got quite a few members. It's quite inspiring, really.
Love that. How long's she been in post?
Oh, maybe a year and a half, a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it sounds like already making an impact.
Making a huge impact. In fact, she was supposed to start a bit earlier than a year, but she herself fell pregnant. And so they waited for her to come back off maternity leave so that she could pick up the role. Just before she went on maternity leave, I joined BEAMA, and she gave me a call and just said, I will never ask you to put the work and the company first. Your family will always come first. All I can ask is that whilst you're sort of taking care of your family, whilst you're being a mum, whilst you're growing, do the best that you can for our members. And that's certainly what we've done. It's created quite a lot of loyalty, I guess.
I love that. And I think that she's right. And I think that sometimes it's easy to give our family the worst of us and give our colleagues and our clients the best of us.
Yes.
When it definitely needs to be the other way around.
Definitely. And also, once you get that balance right, and also I've not always had that balance right, once you get that balance right, your own mindset change, so you become less susceptible to burnout. You are able to prioritise and pace yourself a bit better. And that in turn results in better work. It results in better communication. It results in sort of better purpose. And the better purpose you have, the better work I feel that you do.
What is it that BEAMA does?
So BEAMA is the trade association for manufacturers of electro-technical products and solutions. So our members, they manufacture the infrastructure that goes into buildings, transport and the electricity grid to enable decarbonisation and ultimately electrification.
And so how long have they been going?
So we'll actually be going for 100 years in next year. So 1905 was when we started.
Okay, and so what's its, and this is going to sound like a really daft question, but what's its primary objective?
So the primary objective would be to enable a level playing field for electrification.
What does that mean?
So in order to meet net zero, we are going to have to decarbonise our homes, we're going to have to decarbonise our transport, and we're going to have to make sure that we've really got enough electricity capacity to enable us to do that. Because although we'll be looking at multiple different energy types when it comes to net zero, electrification has been proven as probably main way forward, especially for homes. So we're starting looking at what do we do to decarbonise the homes and transports we live in, whilst giving you, the consumer, giving you choice. So how do we make it affordable? How do we make it timely? And how do we give you options so that you can decarbonise your homes in the best way that suits you? How do we create a level playing field so that as many solutions can be presented to you as possible? And then you can pick what ultimately suits your home and lifestyle or your travel needs best.
I love that. So what you're saying here is that I still have choice. I still can keep my demand where my demand is. So I've got my TV and PlayStation and computer and all the other bits and pieces, and I can still reduce my carbon emissions.
If you go down the electrification route, then definitely if you're looking at perhaps moving from a fossil fuel system to an electric one, from a combustion car to an electric car, you can definitely still reduce your emissions that way. I think this is what our members do. They develop those solutions that enable you to do it. So EV charging points, different electric heating and renewable heating technologies, ventilation, smart controls. They're really trying to make sure that you have as much of a comfortable transition as possible so that when we become net zero, you don't feel like you've missed out. I'm not saying that means we're going to have to do everything exactly the way that we're doing now. Like, there are likely to be behavioural changes, looking at sort of on-peak, off-peak energy use, but we're also pushing to try and make sure that those behavioural changes are actually of benefit to you. So let's make off-peak energy cheaper so you benefit, and your wallet benefits if you decide to use energy that's not at peak time. That enables grid flexibility, that enables us to reduce peak demand and just sort of takes off some of the pressure that the electricity grid may feel. We're potentially, by 2035, looking at a 70% increase in electricity demand in the UK, which is a staggering amount. If you think about the amount we're going to have to actually develop the electricity grid to enable that additional capacity, if you think about all the products that are going to be created to enable you to use that electricity for your heat, for your transport, for your ensuring air quality, whatever that may be, that's a huge jump. That's 10 years nearly. We're nearly in 2025, and 10 years in this industry really is a blink of an eye.
Definitely. And where is that increase coming from?
The increased demand.
Demand, yeah.
So that's coming from homes electrifying, it's coming from transport electrifying, and also industry electrifying as well. We sort of forget that whilst we are trying to ask for more electrification products, while we're asking manufacturers to produce more, we're also asking them to cut their own emissions. So they're probably going to have to look at electrifying quite a lot of their processes as well, and that will create demand on the grid.
Can you give me an example of an area where this is working well?
So that's quite a difficult one to answer at the moment because of the political place that we find ourselves in.
So you're talking political as in the government, or you're talking political as in your customers and how?
The government.
Okay.
Yeah. So I would say that our members are doing an amazing job to realise that this increase in demand is coming, and they're really starting to ramp up their own productions in response. They want to be able to provide us with the products and solutions we need to electrify. But they're doing that around the world. They're producing products that are going to the EU, that are going, sometimes to America, to further out. And in the UK, we're not giving the signals of certainty that manufacturers need to see to heavily invest or drive some of that capacity to the UK market. That is going to change. So we're seeing a lot of work from Ofgem to ensure that the electricity grid has enough capacity and that it's sustainable as it grows. And we're also seeing the likes of the Future Home Standards, which the consultation closed earlier this year. I think they had quite a few responses, so we're not likely to see something tomorrow. But if that comes through, that's going to do an amazing job at driving electrification in new build. And of course, as we produce more homes that are electrified, that then means that we need to produce more capacity through the grid. So that's where the grid investment goes. And, we're sort of on the new build side, especially, we're really starting to make waves. We're starting to see the change. When I first started out in this industry, fresh from university, I would say, so it was a bit of a shock.
What was shocking for you?
I have to say, I think I had an idea in my head of what an industry would be like. And it's probably quite typical of what they teach you at university. Coming into construction, which is a bit bolder, it's quite fast-paced, but hasn't really changed too much. When I joined, hadn't really changed that much. And suddenly we were having these conversations that were very, almost raw in a way. I will say I very quickly fell in love with the specification market, and I actually quite love the ethos behind it. I found it quite exciting. But I also found that it was quite, at the time, static. I remember when the first Future Home Standards consultation came out in 2019, I believe it was, and I was going to all these companies and saying, here's what it says. Electrification. It's saying by 2025, fossil fuels will no longer be the main solution for new build homes. And so many people said to me, no, they won't do it. They won't do it. Nope, they won't do it. We don't need to have this conversation. And now look at us. And that was 5 years ago. So what was quite a static industry where we were just talking about compliance, cost, fit within the standard footprint. Within the space of the sort of 5-6 years I was at my previous company, suddenly shifted. Suddenly the sustainability element started coming in. We started talking about embodied carbon. We started talking about sustainability requirements for suppliers. And these were conversations that, 3, 4, 5 years previous, I very rarely heard.
Mm-hmm. What is embodied carbon?
So it depends whether you're looking from a product or a project perspective. So let's take product first. If you're looking at a standard life cycle assessment, it's what you'd call your A1 to A3 stages, cradle to gate, raw material extraction to being manufactured and then sent outside of the factory to be distributed. When we look broader, we start looking at the products in situ, so that then starts to become more project embodied carbon. And that is the remainder of a life cycle assessment. The reason that I'm making the differentiation there is A1 to A3 product embodied carbon tends to remain quite static. So if you change your suppliers, then yes, the embodied carbon will change. But let's assume that you use the same suppliers, that the process stays the same. The embodied carbon figure stays the same. The rest of the life cycle assessment can vary depending on where you put it, how often it's used, how often you plan to maintain the product, what you plan to do with it end of life, because by that point manufacturers don't tend to have control over what happens at the end of life of a building and their product. So it's quite a broad thing. And if there's one thing that we're really sort of trying to get people to focus on is that split, product and project. But I think most people would say that it makes sense to think of it that way. We did quite a large body of work in the sort of 6-7 months just gone. We did a bit of research into embodied carbon. One of the first things that came out really clearly is that everyone has a different definition. And what made it worse is that almost nobody knew that somebody else might have a different definition to them. So when you said, oh, this company actually feels differently, or we've heard actually it could be this, people were a bit shocked that someone else could be talking about something different. So we've been really trying to get people, when they're talking about embodied carbon, because it's becoming an increasing request of the supply chain, can you provide us with embodied carbon data, to state really clearly what their definition is. Because you can almost find yourself of both having different definitions and not even realising that you do.
That's what we found as a consultancy when organisations are coming to us asking for that very thing. They will compare something from another organisation and say, well, ours is not different to that. Why is it performing differently? And we then need to explain to them, well, there is no regulation in this area at all at the moment. Exactly. And often people are looking at how good can I look as opposed to how close to the truth can I get.
Yeah, and I would say as well, we've done a lot of work on this. So we've recently launched a net zero service to support our members. And one of the first things that we did was look at embodied carbon. And we created the Product Carbon Initiative that basically just looked to lay out the current landscape and the challenges of embodied carbon data. Because you can request embodied carbon data, like for a product, from 2 different manufacturers and not even realise that they're not comparable. And it's not necessarily those 2 manufacturers have tried to, make their numbers better on purpose. It's just that there's no standardization. There's no methodology to follow. There's no best practice. Depending on who you go to, there are, hundreds of databases out there that you can pull assumptions from. And because of the complexities of our supply chains right now, we have to work with assumptions. In the future, we'll be able to do exact data, but we're not there yet. So if you're using the same methodology but a different database for your assumption, maybe you're using UK government, maybe you're using DEFRA data. Maybe you have paid a third party to help you out because it's a really complex job. They've got their own database. And it just means nothing's comparable between it. We are working to solve that, but some of the standards and best practice, it takes quite a while to actually write it down. It takes a while to agree what that practice is going to be, and then once we have it, it's going to take a while for manufacturers to adopt it. So the whole point of this initiative was really to try and help explain from a supply chain point of view why we can't always supply accurate data like the market wants. We'd love to be able to do it, but we're just not there yet. This
may be a difficult question for you to answer, but have you done any work with BSI in and around this? Because BSI are a standards group.
They are. We work very closely with BSI. We speak to them a lot. We're just about to look at forming a committee to help write some of this best practice, and BSI involved in that. And we've also got civil servants involved as well, really trying to make sure that this isn't another spin-off. 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 companies use it and the rest of industry doesn't. In many ways, having a new initiative, a new way of doing things isn't helpful. We just all need to get together and agree one approach, one standard. That's going to require us probably writing it ourselves as a supply chain with BSI support, because obviously they're the standards body. We want to involve them in what we do. It's
interesting, isn't it, how the place that we want to get to, as in a more sustainable world, more sustainable environment, for at least in the construction industry, it means we need to be less competitive and we need to be more collaborative. And that actually collaboration is the antithesis of sustainability.
Very, very much so. I said our new net zero service is all about trying to help our members become informed so that they can strategise their net zero journey with as much knowledge as possible. So we're looking at helping them reduce their emitted and their embodied emissions whilst aligning to a circular economy. And we've got key areas we need to do around that, advocacy with government, engaging with upstream and downstream supply chains. But most importantly, building a community. Because one company cannot fill the gaps we have alone. This needs to be something that we decide to do as a sector. Now, at BEAMA, as I said, we have manufacturers who create sort of the technologies we need for electrification, so the energy infrastructure. We are only one part of the construction supply chain, as you all know. And we're also speaking to other trade associations to say, right, let's not just make this a BEAMA thing. We've got 200 members that can sign up to this. But in itself, is that enough? Should we bring in other associations as well, other members of the supply chain? And then let's start doing things one way, just across the board. We're moving so fast. I think we forget sometimes that best practice, that standardization needs to catch up. And then the policy on top as well, which sort of needs to underpin a lot of what we do. We're trying to do things as fast as we can, but we need to do them in a way which is, best practice. We need to do it in a way that everyone can adopt, which is fair. And the only way to do that is to sit down and start having conversations.
You mentioned about government, and at the moment, we are in the past. When this podcast is out, we're going to be in the future.
Yes.
So we don't know what government is going to be running the country, but irrespective of what government it is, what support or effort will be needed from the government?
So we've actually just launched a manifesto around this, looking at what we sort of need from government kiosks. I think one of the things that has become really apparent in the last sort of couple of months, if not year, is that climate change, net zero sustainability has almost been used as a sort of election tool. So it's been used to try and get votes. So that means that there are policies that are previously put in place that have been rolled back on. And that doesn't necessarily create an environment of certainty for businesses. There's quite a lot of policy that we've seen sort of drafted, consultations we were expecting, response to future home standards, and sort of other things as well where we really need to see those continue. One of the last things we need is a new government coming in, looking at the work that sort of businesses have sort of underpinned their future development on and scrapping it. In many ways, some of these pieces we just need to really make sure that even though they could potentially have come under a previous government, who knows where we're going to be, that they continue.
And what would you say to people that will say, well, I don't know why we're bothering in the UK anyway, because the total amount of CO2 emissions that we produce are far less than countries like China or India or Russia?
So I would quote my CEO here, and she has a really brilliant line where she says, we either all meet net zero or none of us do. And I really think that is where we are. So even if we are further ahead in some areas than other countries, that doesn't mean that we should stop. I do agree that net zero needs to work for you. So this is where really the manufacturers come in.
So you're talking commercially viable here?
Yeah, commercially viable, products that people desire, products that people can afford, products that people want to use or want to change their habits for. And I believe, looking at the sort of track record of our members, of our industry, of manufacturing, that we have a lot of the solutions already that we need. But we also have an absolute brilliant potential to innovate. All we need is the certainty. So we need the certainty from government that investment in the UK, investment in low carbon technologies is the right way to go. That certainty comes from strategy and policies that aren't overturned. It comes from long-term roadmaps that are set. The reason why net zero has been as powerful as it has is because it's a legal target. If it wasn't a legal target, then maybe it would be moved by now, and that removes the certainty. But I don't think we should ever sort of undervalue the impact that having something in law actually has.
You mentioned that net zero is a legal target. There's a number of people that won't understand when that happened, how that shows up, or even if that's true. Can you give some context around that?
I can. So it was actually Theresa May's government, one of the last things that she did. She enshrined net zero by 2050 into UK law. So what that means is we have said that legally by the year 2050 we will be net zero as a country. That was a huge thing to do, incredibly challenging, but it draws a line in the sand, and now we all know the target that we're working towards. We have almost carbon budgets coming up to 2050 that are almost like markers for how we're doing. How many emissions do we want to reduce, and by when? We've met them to date so far, but in the UK we haven't included aviation and shipping in those emissions.
Is farming included in there as well?
I believe farming's included. So we'll have to wait and see what happens when aviation and shipping is included in our emissions. But right now we've done an amazing job at decarbonising electricity. That's where most of our gains have been. But we now, I think the CCC said we need to quadruple the amount of emissions reductions happening outside the power sector.
And the CCC is?
That is the Climate Change Committee.
Okay.
So they advise government on how the UK is doing to reach net zero, and they make suggestions of what we can do to go back on course. Whether the government choose to listen to their suggestions is a different matter. When we start looking at what we can do in the UK to help other countries try and reduce their emissions, it's mainly down to the government they have. But supply chains are a global thing, and if we start saying in the UK we want low carbon products, in our building we want to put low operational carbon but also low embodied carbon. If we start looking at sustainability requests from companies who may be providing you products into the UK, but their main head office is based in Europe, perhaps, we start to see how we can influence on a global scale. I'm a firm believer that we will reach net zero. Policy will have an element, but it will be that commercial driver that really helps to get us there.
You speak very passionately about this topic, and you can see and understand why you're in the role that you are. But for those people that are listening and watching, what role is it that you do? And I'd love for you to go into as much detail as you can about how you got the job that you're doing.
So I'm the head of net zero and clean tech. 2 parts to my role, so I'll split them up. The first is helping our members to reduce their emitted and embodied carbon, so become net zero, whilst aligning for circular economy. So there's no point reducing your emissions if perhaps you're not going to start looking at the more sustainability aspects. What I do with that is I support our members with questions they have. I try and tie our members up with market initiatives that are going on. We try and fill some of the standardization best practice gaps that we've got. So how can we make sure we're moving down the path in the same way, for example, or a fair way? One of the things that we're seeing is sustainability being used for commercial tendering more and more. So that might be you have to have a climate commitment in order to tender. You have to be aligned with science-based targets. You have to be able to give us embodied carbon, whatever it is. And sometimes as well, we're increasingly seeing companies actually scored on it. So the way that you win a tender could be tied into your sustainability approach internally. So trying to make sure that we have fair practices, a level playing field is really key in some of the things that we're doing. And we're also looking at some of the sort of underpinning of what it means to be net zero, like how do you actually get there? And that's something that we find is really missing. So you as a company may say, we want to do the right thing. We want to have brilliant climate commitments. We want to sign up. We want to be net zero. So the way that this service actually started was we started giving information on Race to Zero for SMEs, encouraging manufacturers to say we'll be net zero by 2050. And we saw an amazing response. And then we saw the flood of emails. Now what? Now what do I do? And what we found, I spend a lot of time reading a lot of academic material, a lot of regulation, looking at some of the things that the market's asking for, different ways of doing things, trying to provide that support so that manufacturers can make informed decisions about the now what. Now what do we do is a key part to it. So the way I describe it is that if you a company climbing your net zero mountain, when you're stood at the top, you're like, we've done it. We've got net zero emissions. What we are doing is we're showing to our members all the different routes up that mountain that they may want to take within each of the sections. What tools are available to help them? Who's there to give them a helping hand? Who's also trying to scale the mountain? And you may find benefit in helping each other out and or learning from each other. And then saying to our members, right, now that you can make an informed decision, you can go away and look at your business strategy for net zero. So that's the first half of my role. The second half looks at the clean technology market. So that is looking at the building regulations. We've worked with Darren Evans, and I have in previous companies as well, looking at SAP, now HEM modelling. All of that falls under my remit of sort of leading within BEAMA, and also looking at energy efficiency policy. So that's energy efficiency for products, but it's also energy efficiency beyond the building regulations. So how can we encourage commercial buildings to be more energy efficiency? There are schemes that have been floated around performance frameworks. What do we do about retrofitting our housing stock? So the two conversations kind of tie in together quite well. It's this whole net zero aspect, but you've got the net zero industrial decarbonisation side, and then you've got the net zero market side.
Exciting role.
Yeah.
Busy role.
Busy role, brilliant role. So I never have an issue getting up in the morning and saying, I want to get up and do this. I never have an issue with sort of drive or passion to try and move things forward. So my previous company were members of BEAMA. So I spoke to Gisela a lot when she was in her previous role. I spent a lot of time at the BEAMA meetings. So obviously I've told you about the net zero sides, but BEAMA do a lot of quite technical, detailed work on, changes to product regulations, for example, looking at the impact of things that are happening in the market and what it means. So I knew who Gisela was. I'd worked quite closely with them. I said there are some things that I knew even then were better done on a industry level. So if we have an idea, primary energy was a brilliant example. We had done work and research into the impact of primary energy, written up these reports. But what use is that? If we know what the impact is, we've got very little chance of changing government's mind, even if they did take the reports. Take them to a trade association who read it, check it, and then say, you're right, this is the impact that primary energy could have. It's potentially a huge shift for the industry, which it was. Let's now take that to other BEAMA members, and let's start having this conversation as an industry, where then the industry is aligned on a position, and then you're able to get basically more heard by government because there's more voices saying the same thing.
The other thing as well, just as you're speaking there, even in that relationship with Giselle, you were proactive in that area, because there's lots of networking events or other types of trade shows or meeting places where it's easy just to go in, stick in a lane and just get your head down and do what you're there to do, but without going and adding that extra bit of value and seeking out that relationship.
I enjoy building things. And I think that's perhaps what they saw in me at my previous company. The specification market, we were a company that had been around for ages, a very successful company. Moving into the specification market was a new market for us. So although my boss at the time, he was so supportive of me, like he took a chance by giving me the role in the first place, by hiring me. He gave me the space I needed to be able to say, if I were to pick this up and build it, what would it be? And Gisela did the same thing for me, really, at BEAMA, which was giving me that space to say, right, if I'm good at building things, what could this look like? And again, I've always made sure that, it's not my vision, because someone working on their own vision will soon find themselves misguided. I got input from our members. I got input from the market. I got input from civil servants. So ultimately what we created was reflective as much as it could be, which provides value.
Love that. I could sit and talk to you for at least another hour, but time does not permit. But what we need to do now is go to the demolition zone.
Yes.
Are you ready?
I am.
Let's do it. Okay, so this is great. It's for those people that are listening, those 4 blocks connected in a circular manner with, it looks like the corresponding color of block pointing in towards a central, what looks like a pivot to me.
Yep.
What does it represent?
So it represents the fact that we need to move to a more circular economy to begin with. And that means that we need more communication across the board. But it also shows that in order to meet net zero, and if I had one, I'd put a little sign in that middle block saying net zero, hooray. We all need to communicate with each other. It's all interlinked. It's all tied together. We need to be working together. We need to be communicating. We need to realise we're part of the same sector, part of the same supply chain. And meeting net zero, which is a huge challenge, is only going to happen with that collaboration and discussion.
This is reminding me of the conversation that we had earlier on when you spoke about the work that you're doing with BSI and other organisations to try and look at this as a more collaborative approach to solve the problem. And I'm completely with you. I think that this is the only way that we can solve the problem, and also the only way that we can be sustainable is by working together. And I'm just wondering if there is any invitation that you have for our listeners or those people that are watching to try and invoke a more collaborative way of approaching this.
Yeah, definitely. I think I would say the supply chain is here and ready to listen. They're ready to engage. BEAMA, especially, because I'm going to say that because that's me, we would be open to any opportunity of discussion, any work streams that would be valuable for us to join, any project or ideas that the market may have which would benefit from input of the supply chain. Because really, when you think about it, the supply chain is the enabler of net zero. It's the enabler of downstream to meet their scope 3 emissions. And we are open and ready to have any of these discussions. We have a flexible work plan at BEAMA that means that, if an opportunity comes up to work together on something, we're ready. Our members are ready. Let's have the discussion. Let's work on it together. Offshoots are not helpful for anyone. We don't need any more, people going off and doing things in their own singular way. Let's start acting more like we're in this circular, engaged supply chain, which we are.
So what would this look like? So someone's listening to this. So give me an example of the type of industry that you'd be open to having a conversation with, how they would reach out to you and how they would start a conversation.
So I'll go for 2 different examples, if that's okay. So I'd say the first way to reach out to us is through our website. So beama.org.uk. That's BEAMA.org.uk. We would be open to any projects that you're looking at and the challenge of sustainability or net zero and how to reach it. So maybe you as a company are just starting to look at having embodied carbon as part of your tendering requirements. And you're wondering, what do you need to be aware of? What do you need to be thinking about? Where might some of the challenges be? That's something that we can help you with. We can have a discussion on if you've got an idea for how we might be able to solve some of the standardization challenges we have. Again, something we're really willing to listen to. It may be that you're a house builder or a developer who've got science-based targets and you're starting to realise that you need to reduce your scope 3 emissions, but actually that's largely out of your control. The supply chain can do things to help you reduce your scope 3 emissions. So if you're looking at potentially what we could do, what you could do to reduce those emissions, have a conversation, what's feasible, what's not, get in contact, and there's definitely discussions that we can have.
Love that. That's really good. Amy, I've loved having you on the show. It's been great to listen to your passion, to your wisdom, and to hear the story of what you have done personally, as well as what BEAMA are doing as well, being led by an inspirational chief executive.
Definitely. Well, thank you for having me.